My parents gave me the worst childhood, and when I grew up, they sued me to return my grandmother's inheritance. I was 17 when my world truly started to crumble. My grandmother, who had always been my refuge in a chaotic family, passed away suddenly. She left me a 6,000 inheritance and a sapphire ring that I had adored since I was a child. The ring was the color of the deepest ocean, mesmerizing and rare. It was one of the few things that brought me comfort after her passing. Little did I know that this inheritance would be the catalyst for the worst experience of my life. Amber, my older sister by 6 years, had always been the star of the family. She was the apple of my parents' eye, and I was just the shadow that followed her. Amber was beautiful, charismatic, and ambitious, but she also had a cruel streak that she reserved just for me. From as early as I can remember, she would belittle me, mock me, and make me feel like I was nothing. My parents never stopped her, in fact. They often laughed it off, telling me that I was too sensitive, that I needed to toughen up. It wasn't just physical bullying, it was psychological torture. Amber knew how to get under my skin, and she did it every chance she got. When I was 13, Amber did something that I could never forgive. It was a family vacation to the beach, and Amber, who was then 19, brought along a couple of her college friends. I was excited about the trip, hoping that for once I could have a good time without Amber ruining it, but I should have known better. We were on the pier, and I decided to sit alone, dangling my feet over the edge, enjoying the serenity of the ocean. Suddenly, a plastic bag was shoved over my head, and before I could react, I felt a hard kick in my back, sending me plunging into the water. Panic surged through me as I struggled to tear the bag off my head, the water filling my nose and mouth. When I finally managed to rip it off and get to the surface, I saw Amber and her friends running away, laughing as if they had just played the funniest prank in the world. I stumbled back to my parents, drenched and terrified, and told them what had happened. But instead of comforting me, they laughed along with Amber, saying I was overreacting, that it was just a joke. My dad even joked that at least those swimming lessons had finally paid off. It was then that I realized I was truly alone. My parents would never protect me from Amber, and Amber would never stop tormenting me. After that, I withdrew from everyone. I stopped trying to get close to my parents, and I avoided Amber as much as I could. I focused on my studies, knowing that my only way out of this nightmare was to get into a good college and leave home for good. But even as I tried to keep my head down, Amber continued to find ways to hurt me. When my grandmother passed away and left me the 6,000 inheritance, I thought I finally had something that was mine, something that could help me build a future away from my toxic family. But Amber had other plans. She was starting a boutique with a couple of her friends, a high-end store that sold shoes and accessories. She needed capital, and my parents decided that my inheritance should be used to help her. They didn't ask me if I wanted to contribute, they simply told me that I had to. When I refused, my father threatened to cut off my college tuition and forbid me from returning home once I left. I was terrified. College was my only escape, my only chance at a better life. So, after days of relentless pressure, I caved. I handed over the 6,000 to Amber, trying to convince myself that it was the right thing to do. At least they let me keep the sapphire ring, probably because they didn't realize how much it was worth. I told myself that as long as I could leave for college, it would all be worth it. A few months passed, and I received my acceptance letter to my dream college. My parents were true to their word. They promised to cover all my expenses, including tuition and living costs. I thought that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to work out for me. Amber's boutique opened shortly after I received my acceptance letter. She had a grand launch party, which I wasn't invited to, but that didn't bother me. I didn't want to be there, surrounded by people who had always treated me like I was invisible. But the next day, Amber sent me a text message thanking me for my contribution, saying she couldn't have done it without my help. Attached to the message were several photos from the event. As I scrolled through them, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Kevin was Amber's high school boyfriend, a man who had caused more trouble in our family than anyone else. He was 6 years older than Amber, and they had started dating right after she turned 18. My parents had always disliked him, especially after he got caught embezzling money from his father's company. He was sent away to live with his uncle in another state, and Amber was forced to cut all ties with him. But there he was, standing in the background of the photos, laughing and chatting with Amber and her friends. I knew immediately that something was wrong. My parents had been discussing Amber's business around me for months, and I knew that one of Amber's friends' mothers, Mrs. Lawson, was the last potential investor who was holding out. Mrs. Lawson was a shrewd businesswoman who was skeptical about investing in a boutique. She wanted her daughter, one of Amber's partners, to gain some work experience first. They were relying on a successful launch to convince Mrs. Lawson to invest. Seeing Kevin at the party gave me an idea. I knew how much my parents and Amber had lied to Mrs. Lawson, downplaying Kevin's involvement. I created a fake social media account and contacted Mrs. Lawson, telling her that I had some important information about Amber's business. I implied that Amber was hiding something and sent her the photos of Kevin at the party. I also sent some old photos of Amber and Kevin together, suggesting that Amber had rekindled her relationship with a man who was nothing but trouble. The next day, everything started to unravel. Mrs. Lawson pulled out of the deal and told her daughter to do the same. Amber's friends were furious when they found out she had lied about Kevin. They blamed her for ruining their chances of getting the investment they needed. The boutique was barely holding on, and without Mrs. Lawson's investment, it was on the brink of collapse. My parents were livid, but they had no idea I was the one who had contacted Mrs. Lawson. They blamed Amber for being reckless and untrustworthy. For the first time in my life, I saw them truly disappointed in her. It should have felt like a victory, but instead, I was consumed with guilt. Amber's business quickly went under. Her friends abandoned her, and she was left alone to deal with the fallout. My parents tried to help her salvage the situation, but even they couldn't fix the mess she had made. Amber's life was falling apart, and I was the one who had caused it. With Amber's world crumbling around her, I expected her to lash out at me, but she didn't. Instead, she withdrew into herself, becoming cold and distant. She rarely spoke to me, and when she did, it was with a chilling calmness that unnerved me. I tried to avoid her as much as possible, focusing on my upcoming move to college. I thought that once I left, I could finally put all of this behind me, but I was wrong. One night, just a week before I was set to leave for college, I received a call from my parents. Amber had disappeared. She hadn't come home after a night out, and they were frantic. They asked if I knew where she might be, but I didn't. I hadn't spoken to her in days. They called all of her friends, but no one knew where she was. For days, there was no word from Amber. My parents were beside themselves with worry, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. I knew Amber was volatile, but this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Then one evening, Amber returned home. She was disheveled and quiet, with a haunted look in her eyes. My parents were relieved to have her back, but I could tell something was seriously wrong. She didn't tell them where she had been, only that she needed some time alone. They didn't press her for details, happy just to have her home. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside my window. I looked out and saw Amber standing in the yard, staring up at my window. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see something glinting in her hand. It was a piece of rebar, and she was gripping it so tightly her knuckles were white. I quickly closed the curtains and locked my bedroom door, my heart racing. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid of what Amber might do. The next morning, she was gone again. My parents assumed she had gone out for a walk, but I knew better. I knew she was planning something. A few days later, I was on my way back from a late-night study session at the library when I noticed someone following me. I quickened my pace, trying to lose them, but they stayed close behind. I ducked into a side street, hoping to shake them off, but the footsteps grew louder, closer. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head, and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the cold, hard ground. My vision was blurry, but I could make out Amber standing over me, the rebar clutched in her hand. Her face was twisted in rage, her eyes wild with hatred. "You ruined everything," she screamed, bringing the rebar down on me again. Pain exploded in my chest as the metal connected with my ribs. I tried to crawl away, but she was relentless, striking me over and over, venting all of her anger and frustration on me. I could feel my bones cracking under the force of her blows, my body going numb from the pain. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was Amber standing over me, breathing heavily, the rebar slick with my blood. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, my body wrapped in bandages, tubes and wires connected to me everywhere. The pain was unbearable, but I was alive. My friend's parents were there, holding my hand, tears in their eyes. They told me that Amber had been arrested, that she was in custody and facing charges for what she had done to me. The trial was a grueling experience. Amber's lawyer tried to argue that she had been driven to insanity by the stress of losing her business, that she wasn't in her right mind when she attacked me. But the evidence was overwhelming. The police had found the rebar with my blood on it, and there were witnesses who had seen her following me that night. My parents were devastated. They couldn't believe that Amber, their perfect daughter, was capable of such violence. But the truth was undeniable. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding her guilty of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. I spent months in the hospital recovering from my injuries. The physical scars would heal in time, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. I had lost my family, my sense of security, and the only home I had ever known. I was left with nothing but pain and a deep, abiding fear that I would never truly be safe again. But through it all, I found strength in the people who had taken me in. They became my new family, helping me rebuild my life one day at a time. They stood by me during the trial, visited me in the hospital, and supported me as I slowly pieced my life back together. I eventually returned to college, determined to make something of myself despite everything that had happened. The sapphire ring that my grandmother had left me became a symbol of my resilience, a reminder that I had survived the worst and come out stronger. Amber would spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying for the pain she had inflicted on me. My parents, unable to cope with the reality of what their golden child had become, eventually moved away, cutting all ties with me. I never saw them again. In the end, I learned that some battles leave scars that never fully heal, but with the right people by your side, you can find a way to move forward. Amber may have tried to destroy me, but she only made me stronger. And as I look to the future, I know that I will never let anyone take that strength away from me again. That night, as I walked back to my dorm after a late study session, I felt uneasy. The campus was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify every small sound. My footsteps echoed against the pavement, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling as though I was being watched. The streetlights cast long shadows that danced with the breeze, creating an unsettling atmosphere. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the paranoia that had been growing inside me since Amber's return. She had been acting so strangely, almost as if she was a different person entirely. It wasn't just her cold demeanor, or the way she had withdrawn from everyone, it was the way she looked at me, with eyes that seemed to hold a deep, seething hatred. I couldn't understand it, but I knew something was wrong. Then, as I turned the corner into a narrow, dimly lit alley that cut through the campus, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, determined footsteps. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps quickened too. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the fear rising in my throat. I didn't dare look back. I started to run, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. But before I could get far, something hard struck the back of my head. Pain exploded in my skull, and I crumpled to the ground, the world spinning around me. I tried to push myself up, but I was too disoriented. Then, I heard her voice, Amber's voice. "You ruined everything!" she screamed. And I turned my head just in time to see her standing over me, a piece of rebar clutched tightly in her hands, her face twisted in a mask of rage and despair. Before I could react, she brought the rebar down with all her strength, striking me in the ribs. The pain was excruciating, unlike anything I had ever felt. I could hear the sickening crack of bones breaking, feel the hot rush of blood filling my mouth. I tried to scream, but it came out as a gurgle, my lungs unable to draw in enough air. Amber hit me again and again, each blow more brutal than the last. My vision blurred as the pain overwhelmed me, and I felt myself slipping away. But Amber didn't stop. She kept swinging, her fury driving her to beat me mercilessly, even as my body went limp. Finally, everything went dark. When I woke up, I wasn't sure where I was or how much time had passed. All I knew was that I was in excruciating pain, and I could barely move. I was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, tubes and wires connected to my body in a tangled mess. My head throbbed, my chest felt like it was on fire, and every breath was a struggle. I tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through my body, and I let out a weak cry. The door to the room opened, and a nurse rushed in. She looked surprised to see me awake, and immediately called for the doctor. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry, my voice barely a whisper. The nurse gently pressed a button to raise the bed so I could sit up slightly, but the movement made my head swim. The doctor came in a few moments later, a kind-looking man in his 50s with graying hair and glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He smiled reassuringly at me, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "You're awake," he said softly, checking the machines and making notes on the chart at the foot of my bed. "You've been through quite an ordeal. Just take it easy for now, all right? You're safe here." I wanted to ask what had happened, how long I had been unconscious, but the words wouldn't come. The doctor seemed to understand, though, and he gave me a brief summary of my condition. "You were attacked," he said gently, as if trying not to startle me. "Your injuries were severe multiple fractures, a concussion, internal bleeding. We had to perform emergency surgery to stop the bleeding and repair the damage to your organs. You're very lucky to be alive." Lucky. That word echoed in my mind. I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken, shattered both physically and emotionally. Amber had done this to me, me own sister. The thought was almost too much to bear. Over the next few days, I learned more about what had happened. After Amber had beaten me unconscious, she had left me for dead in that alley. A group of students had found me several hours later, barely clinging to life, and had called for help. I had been rushed to the hospital, where the doctors worked tirelessly to save me. They had put me in a medically induced coma to allow my body to heal, and I had been unconscious for over a week. Amber, meanwhile, had been arrested shortly after the attack. Witnesses had seen her following me that night, and the police had found the rebar covered in my blood hidden in her car. When they confronted her, she didn't even try to deny what she had done. She confessed on the spot, telling the officers that I had destroyed her life, that I had driven her to do it. The trial was one of the most painful experiences of my life. I was still in the hospital, still recovering from the physical trauma, but the emotional trauma was just as raw. I had to face Amber in court, had to listen as her lawyer tried to paint her as a victim, as someone who had been pushed to the edge by my supposed cruelty. They brought up the fact that I had sabotaged her business, that I had lied to our parents and manipulated events to ruin her. They tried to twist everything to make it look like I was the one at fault, that Amber had been driven to madness by my actions. It was agonizing to sit there and listen to it all, to see the way Amber glared at me from across the courtroom, her eyes filled with hatred. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the bloody rebar, the witness testimonies, and the confession Amber had given to the police. They showed the extent of my injuries, the medical reports detailing the damage she had inflicted on me. The jury listened intently, their faces growing more horrified with each passing day. My parents were there too, sitting in the front row. I couldn't bring myself to look at them. I didn't want to see the disappointment, the shame in their eyes. They had always favored Amber, always taken her side, but now they were confronted with the brutal reality of what she had become. I wondered if they blamed themselves, if they realized how much they had contributed to this nightmare by always putting Amber first. In the end, the jury found Amber guilty of murder in the second degree. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, relief that she would never be able to hurt me again, but also an overwhelming sadness for the sister I had lost long before that fateful night. Amber didn't show any emotion as she was led away in handcuffs. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge the verdict. She simply walked out of the courtroom, her face a blank mask. I knew that I would never see her again, and part of me was grateful for that. But the trial wasn't the end of my ordeal. The physical recovery was long and grueling. I had to undergo multiple surgeries to repair the damage Amber had done. My ribs had to be reconstructed with metal plates, my skull had to be stabilized, and I had to relearn how to do even the most basic tasks. Every movement was painful, every breath a reminder of the night I had almost died. The emotional recovery was even harder. I struggled with nightmares, reliving the attack over and over again in my mind. I couldn't trust anyone, couldn't feel safe even in my own home. My parents tried to reach out to me, to offer their support, but I couldn't bring myself to accept it. They had enabled Amber's behavior for so long, and now I couldn't forgive them for what they had allowed to happen. I found solace in the few friends who had stood by me through everything. They were my lifeline, helping me navigate the darkness that had settled over my life. With their support, I slowly began to rebuild, to piece together the fragments of who I had once been. I returned to college eventually, determined to finish my degree and build a future for myself, one that wasn't defined by the pain and trauma of my past. The sapphire ring that my grandmother had left me became a symbol of my resilience, a reminder that I had survived the worst and could overcome anything. Amber would spend the rest of her life in prison, paying for the pain she had inflicted on me. My parents eventually moved away, cutting all ties with me. They couldn't bear the shame, the guilt of what had happened. I never saw them again, and I was okay with that. I needed to move on, to focus on my own healing. As the years passed, the physical scars faded, but the emotional scars remained. Some wounds never fully heal, but I learned to live with them. I found strength in my pain, in the knowledge that I had survived something that could have easily destroyed me. Amber had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she'd only made me stronger. I was determined to live a life filled with meaning, with purpose, and with the love and support of the people who truly cared about me. I knew I would carry the memory of that night with me for the rest of my life, but I also knew that I would never let it define me. I was a survivor, and no matter what, I would keep moving forward. After Amber was sentenced to life in prison, I thought the nightmare was finally over. I had survived her brutal attack, endured the long and painful recovery, and even managed to return to college. I was slowly rebuilding my life, trying to find some semblance of normalcy after everything that had happened. But I was wrong. The worst was yet to come. My relationship with my parents had deteriorated to the point where we barely spoke. They had always favored Amber, and even after she was convicted of trying to kill me, they couldn't fully accept the reality of who she had become. I knew they blamed me, at least partially, for what had happened. They had always seen Amber as the perfect daughter, and now she was in prison, her life ruined. In their eyes, I had played a role in that, and they couldn't forgive me. I had cut off almost all contact with them, focusing on my recovery and my studies. But one day, out of the blue, my mother called me. She sounded desperate, pleading with me to meet her at the family home. She said she needed to talk, that she couldn't go on without clearing the air between us. Despite my better judgment, I agreed. I didn't want to believe that my own mother could hate me enough to do something drastic. I thought that maybe, just maybe, we could find some common ground, some way to move forward. When I arrived at the house, it felt strange to be back. The place where I had grown up now felt foreign, almost hostile. My mother was waiting for me in the backyard, standing by the old garden shed. She looked older, more worn than I remembered, her face etched with lines of worry and grief. She didn't greet me with a hug or even a smile. Instead, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her voice strained. "We need to talk about Amber." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I know it's hard, Mom, but Amber, what she did." My mother cut me off with a sharp wave of her hand. "No," she snapped. "You don't understand. Amber was pushed to the edge because of you. You ruined her life, and now she's in prison because of your selfishness." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Mom, Amber tried to kill me," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "She beat me with a rebar. She would have killed me if those students hadn't found me. How can you blame me for that?" "She wouldn't have done that if you hadn't sabotaged her business," my mother hissed, taking a step closer to me. "You're the reason she snapped. You turned everyone against her. You betrayed your own sister." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had expected anger, maybe even some harsh words, but not this. Not the blind, seething hatred that was pouring out of my mother now. "Mom, Amber made her own choices," I said, trying to reason with her. "I had nothing to do with it. She was always cruel to me, even when we were kids. You know that. You deserved it," my mother screamed, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "You were always weak, always whining and complaining. Amber was the strong one, the one with a future, and you took that away from her." I took a step back, suddenly afraid. My mother's eyes were wild, her face twisted with fury. I had never seen her like this before, and it terrified me. I glanced around, realizing for the first time that we were completely alone. There was no one to help me, no one to stop her if she decided to act on the rage that was boiling over. "Mom, I'm sorry you feel that way," I said cautiously, trying to de-escalate the situation. "But I'm not responsible for what happened to Amber. She made her own decisions." "You ruined her life," my mother shrieked, her voice breaking. "And now I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Before I could react, she lunged at me, grabbing a shovel that was leaning against the garden shed. I barely had time to register what was happening before she swung it at me with all her strength. The metal edge of the shovel connected with the side of my head, and I collapsed to the ground, dazed and bleeding. I tried to get up, but the world was spinning, my vision blurring from the impact. I could taste blood in my mouth, feel it trickling down the side of my face. My mother stood over me, breathing heavily, the shovel raised high above her head. "You took everything from me!" she screamed, bringing the shovel down again, this time striking my ribs. The pain was unbearable, and I cried out, curling into a ball to protect myself. But she didn't stop. She kept hitting me, each blow more vicious than the last. I could hear the bones in my chest cracking, feel the life draining out of me with every brutal strike. I tried to beg her to stop, but the words wouldn't come. My body was broken, my mind slipping into darkness. The last thing I saw was my mother's face, twisted with rage, as she brought the shovel down one final time. When I woke up, I was in the hospital again, but this time, I wasn't alone. My friend's parents were there, holding my hand, their faces pale with shock. They told me that my mother had been arrested, that she had been caught red-handed by a neighbor who had heard the commotion and called the police. She was now in custody, facing charges of attempted murder. I was barely alive when they found me, they said. The doctors had performed emergency surgery to save my life, but the damage was severe. I had multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a traumatic brain injury. The doctors weren't sure if I would ever fully recover. The trial was a surreal experience, one that I could barely process through the fog of pain and medication. My mother's lawyer tried to argue that she had been driven to madness by grief, that losing Amber had pushed her over the edge. They painted her as a broken woman, a mother who had lost everything and couldn't cope with the pain. But the evidence was clear. The neighbor's testimony, the forensic evidence, the brutal injuries I had sustained, it all pointed to the cold, hard truth. My mother had tried to kill me, just like Amber had. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. They found her guilty of attempted murder, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison. As the verdict was read, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This was my mother, the woman who had raised me, who had once loved me. But now she was a stranger, someone who had tried to take my life in a fit of blind rage. I didn't know how to feel. There was no relief, no closure, just a deep, aching emptiness. My father didn't attend the trial. He had left shortly after my mother's arrest, disappearing without a trace. I didn't know where he had gone, and I didn't care. I had lost my entire family, but after everything they had done, I realized that maybe I'd never truly had one to begin with. The recovery process was long and difficult. I had to undergo multiple surgeries to repair the damage my mother had done. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional pain was even worse. I was plagued by nightmares, haunted by the image of my mother standing over me, the shovel in her hands. I couldn't trust anyone, couldn't feel safe, even in the hospital. But through it all, my friends and their families were there for me. They stayed by my side, offering their support and love when I needed it most. They were the ones who helped me piece my life back together, who reminded me that I was more than just a victim. Eventually, I returned to college, determined to finish my degree and build a future for myself. The scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal, but I was determined to keep moving forward. I refused to let my past define me. My mother would spend the rest of her life in prison, just like Amber. I would never see them again, and I was okay with that. They had chosen their path, and I had chosen mine. As the years passed, I found a sense of peace. I built a life for myself, surrounded by people who truly cared about me. The sapphire ring that my grandmother had left me became a symbol of my resilience, a reminder that I had survived the worst and come out stronger. I knew that I would carry the memory of those dark days with me for the rest of my life, but I also knew that I would never let them define who I was. I was a survivor, and no matter what, I would keep moving forward.